we'll cover for you. Hamatakiapi. This is Nick Estes. You're joining the Red Nation live stream, and we have two special guests. We have J. Jeffrey Clark, also known as Jerome Clark, not to be confused with the cryptozoologist. We'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah. And Dr. Elise Boxer. We're going to be discussing this book today. It's called From the Skin: Defending Indigenous Nations Using Theory and Praxis. Thank you both for taking the time to join us today. This is a conversation that kind of extends from a conversation that we started having. Well, I mean, I wrote the foreword to this book, but also we were just at the Native American Indigenous Studies Conference in Oklahoma City at the end of June. And the conversation there, you know, it was, I'll just be honest, it was really nice to revisit some of these things because the three of us went through the trenches. Elise is at the university that I got my undergrad and my master's degree in history. You know, we used to go to the American Indian Studies Association conferences that were hosted at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, where you're based, Jerome. And I met both of you through the American Indian Studies Association, not to be confused with the Native American Indigenous Studies Association. They're two different organizations, similar overlap, but also, you know, different orientations, which we can get into. But before I continue on and ramble, can you both introduce yourself? We'll start with you, Elise, if you want to just introduce yourself and where you're calling from.
Yes, I am Elise Boxer, Namakota. I am Dakota. I am from the Sisseton Wahpeton bands, from the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes, and I am an associate professor here at the University of South Dakota. I am appointed in both Native American Studies and then also history, and yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Tiate, she Jerome Clark in Chiado, Kintlachini, National Sanjikina Bashichin. My description should say Kapaha a Dashinala, Shija Bisadash Chite Naga, do Shima a Tisia Tuate Naga. So that was just my introduction to Navajo, which is comprised of 4 parts of our clan. And I also told everyone where my mother and my father are from. And of course, we do that, as I always share with people, just in case people aren't familiar, that we introduce ourselves that way, just so we let people know who we're coming from and where we're coming from, so that we're making clear who we're responsible to and who's responsible for us and the place we're responsible to too.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll just start it off with, this actually seems like a basic question, but it's actually a difficult question to answer. How do you define American Indian Studies? And I'll let you think about it for a little bit, because I think it's worth talking a little bit about the history of the field. I'll give you some time to marinate on it, but I work in a department. I'm actually here located in that department at the University of Minnesota, which is the first departmentalized American Indian Studies department in the world. I think it was in 1960. I think it was 1969 is when it was formally departmentalized, and the person who was heading it up at that time was a man named Roger Buffalo Head. He was Ojibwe, but he was part of the Princeton convocation in the 1980s, where they brought together American Indian intellectuals to really hammer out what American Indian Studies would be. You reference it in the book, but yeah, just to kind of give people a little bit of institutional history. I'm not quite sure how many American Indian Studies departments there are in the United States. There aren't very many, and there are actually fewer that have doctoral or advanced degree programs. Ours just, we're just inaugurated our first doctoral program, but that kind of gives you an idea. I mean, people think of Indigenous studies as this kind of broad, global international field, and it very much is. But American Indian Studies is, I think, one of the sort of founding fields of what we now know as this kind of international, global phenomena. But I'll kick it over to whoever wants to take that question first.
I was joking, but I don't know, Jerome, if you want to go first.
Your careers are literally on the line. You're both representing your department.
I was telling Elise she's my older, so I'll go ahead and let her speak first.
No, actually, so Nick, as you were asking that question, I thought it was, you are right, because it sounds like a very basic question, and it is a very difficult question, because I think that kind of highlights the tensions that exist within our discipline, right? Like, how do we define it? And there's such different, contestations over who gets to define it, right? How do we define it? Who gets to teach in it? And in fact, that was one of my interview questions here at the University of South Dakota. And I had started with that, saying like, well, a very, that's an important question, but the tensions that it ultimately highlights. Interestingly enough, so this semester and every fall since I've been here at USD for I think the last 11 years, I teach the Introduction to Native American Studies. And, I had a very specific idea. So I did my PhD in history from Arizona State University, but I eventually found my academic home in the American Indian Studies program. And part of that was because the work that I wanted to do as a historian, I didn't really fulfill like history reflected that. And so I kind of moved over to American Indian Studies as a graduate student, where I just got to kind of TA for them and get an idea of what they taught in the classrooms. And because of that, I always start when I think about what is American Indian Studies, or here at USD it's Native American Studies, and I would say you can do any variation therein, is I always start with the work of Elizabeth Cookland. And I start with that, what I call that article that is foundational to our discipline of Who Stole Native American Studies. And in fact, I taught that this morning. And, we use that article to kind of flesh out, like, what is Native American Studies? So today, I started the first day with, what do you think Native American Studies is? What are your expectations from the course? And I think that kind of their response highlights some of, I think, the challenges we have with our discipline, right? Most students will say, well, I'm interested in American Indian people. Well, okay, like, I just want to study A, B, or C. All right, that's a good starting point. Or like, I grew up in the state, I know about Native people, I don't really know anything beyond that. And so one of the challenges I have is that today we really explored what is a discipline, right? How did American Indian Studies get founded? And as you mentioned, Nick, in that introduction, is that Princeton convocation in 1970 was pivotal, because I think first what it puts on, right, is that idea that we should think about our discipline as separate, right, from history, from anthropology, from English. And in doing so, how do we develop theories and methodologies, right, that reflect, right, indigenous intellectualism, our ties to the land, the way that we think about the world and our connection therein. And that, especially in her article, one of the things I think it's important when she kind of highlights that is that, one, I want students to realize that Indigenous people have always produced knowledge, right? That we have had these knowledges from time immemorial to the present, but that the things that we do in our discipline should be in defense of tribal nations, right? It should be about land. It should be about the recognition and advancement of tribal sovereignty. And then everything is kind of within that framework. But that's kind of like a beginning starting point, because it's dismantling, right, the idea that anybody can do Native studies. Well, you can't just be interested in Indian people, right? You have to, I really tell students, we want to have a perspective from the people themselves. And in doing so, how does that change the way that we think about the world? And I can add more to that, but I don't know, Jerome, if you want to kind of chime in and add more to that.
Yeah, I'm a little tempted to just give a thumbs up reaction to everything that you said. I also like Elise, I actually taught Elizabeth Cookland's article, Who Stole American Indian Studies 2 this week. And I taught it in a slightly different context, which is for our master's program. We have a course here that all students have to take, which is AIS 501, AIS paradigms. And in that class, we start very similarly, and I present a series of readings over starting from the 1970s all the way down to the present to say, what are people saying, what Indigenous studies or American Indian studies does or is, or how do we define it? And beginning with a lot of the same questions that Elise does. And I will say that I start with this because, and just a little bit of background story, is I did my undergraduate here at Arizona State University and got my bachelor's degree here in the American Indian Studies program. And at the time, there were some of the faculty here were James Wrightingham, Susan Miller, Mila Vicente Carpio, and Carol Lujan, for example. And every spring, Elizabeth Cook Lynn would come and teach here. She would teach 2 classes. And so I consider myself pretty lucky to have taken classes with Elizabeth Cook Lynn and actually heard some of the things that she talks about in that article that she actually would talk to us about in class. And so I heard some of those things from her directly before even reading the article myself. But I'm sharing this because one of the things I always remember thinking about was, I feel like through my undergraduate education, there was never a moment of pause where we said, hey, let's talk about what Indigenous studies is and let's figure out what is happening here. We would just go into courses like federal Indian policy and start talking about like the Marshall Trilogy, the treaty rights and treaty relationships, and never once taking a moment saying, okay, what is Native studies? And so I always like to take that reflective moment at the beginning of my class, because a lot of students come in with different ideas of what AIS is or Indigenous studies is. And I always come back to the first time I ever taught an intro class was at Mesa Community College, and I had this older white male student in my class when I went around and said, hey, how'd you all find yourself here? And his response was, well, I'm in this class because I want to put a game together that features Native characters. And pretty much he wanted to come there to learn about Natives and also wanted to learn about culture and things that he could make to make his game, quote unquote, more real. And I always think about that as like a moment of saying, okay, well, it's good that we then say, well, you're not going to learn that here. You're not going to learn about powwows or ceremonies or things like that. You're going to learn about AIS, how I've understood it and how I've learned it. And for me, it always begins around thinking about another person that I learned under here was Waziatowin, who was in the history program here for a few years. And that was the first time I ever took a Native history or a Native studies oriented class. And at the time I was an engineer major, and imagine if you all, I'm sure some of you all who are listening, but I know we all know Waziatowin. And I walked into that class as an engineering student and totally had my mind blown and my worldview totally shifted in that one class. And my life hasn't been the same since, in a good way, of course. And that class, I think one of the most important things I learned in there was asking critical questions about where I was coming from. And when I think about Native studies, it's always oriented around asking questions about the places that we come from. And for me, that centers around things that Elizabeth Cook Lynn tells us that we should be thinking about: indigenousness and sovereignty. And the way that I always, like when you ask the question, the first thing that I always did, the first thing I did that I always do is coming back to how I think about what I do from a Diné perspective. And so for me, one of the things that, I don't know if the right word is to say that I felt like I was given the permission to, but AIS gave me the context from which to think about these questions from a Diné context specifically, and to think about what is it our people are saying about sovereignty? What is it our people are saying about what it means to be a Diné person now, and in the past, and also like in the present colonial moment? And so for me, like, think just what it may seem like a really basic and simple move, but for me, taking that to always thinking about what that means from my specific position helps me to better see what American Indian Studies is, or maybe more specifically, what I consider to be critical Diné studies, which is thinking about what it means to be Diné person in the past and in our colonial present, and what does it mean to defend our land and to think about who we are and to then like tap into that long history of knowledge to articulate some of these things. And I know that doesn't really get to like the one sentence line of like, this is what the definition of AIS is, but I think it's kind of existing in this space of that's very much influenced from people that introduced me to the field. And for me, I don't see an AIS or Indigenous studies that doesn't center sovereignty and also that doesn't center Navajo knowledge. And then working from that position to think about critical questions of what it means to be who we are now.
Yeah, those are really great answers. I have kind of like similar stories to both of you. I was an earth science major. I was going to save the planet, Captain Planet. It's a long story how it wasn't because I took a Native Studies course that I was radicalized. But it's a long story how that happened. But I went from the hard sciences to the humanities, and I never declared as an AIS major at the University of South Dakota, but I had enough credits to do it. That's a whole other story. But I definitely benefited from the department that was there at the time. And, we were sitting at the Native American Indigenous Studies Association conference talking in the hallway as one does. And, one thing that really stuck out to me was just that, even serving on the council of NASA, as it's called, I realized that very few of us were in department homes of American Indian Studies or Indigenous Studies in general, because there's just not a lot of department homes. What's happened, and the reason why Elizabeth Cookland wrote this article, is that it's been sort of the study of Indigenous people or American Indians has been farmed out to other disciplines who have really staked a claim. Anthropology is a huge footprint in the field. So too does history and literature. And oftentimes you'll find people who I joke about this, I shouldn't joke about this, but they'll read some novels, and then they develop an entire career on that without ever having to fully engage Native nations or fully defend sovereignty. The stakes are much different. And reading novels where you can participate in the sort of academic knowledge production, theoretically, and it's not to put that down, but there are different stakes, because it also assumes that people who do American Indian Studies don't also do that. Cook Lynn was a novelist and a poet before she was a theorist. She's kind of more famous for the latter, but she has a whole body of work that's specifically about literature. She has several novels, several books of poetry, creative fiction, creative nonfiction, before she really went into fully engage what she calls the discipline of American Indian Studies. And I similarly have students read. I'm actually, nerd alert. I'm teaching who's still Native American Studies next week in my. But I do have my undergrad students read the Functions of Indian Studies. I can't remember the full chapter name, but it's from New Indians, Old Wars, where she really lays out a pedagogical approach to how to do Native studies and why Native studies is different from other disciplines, why other disciplines like history are allowed to do what she calls endogenous or internal sort of methodologies, and aren't necessarily they don't have the heavy boot of anthropology or economics weighing down on them when they do their archival research or their historical methods. And Native studies deserves that kind of internal, or what she calls endogenous, approach to its field as well. And if you're centering these two things that you named, Jerome, indigenousness and sovereignty, that as you point out in the introduction to this book, is not just a pragmatic or activist or political concern, but it's a series of questions that have different stakes in how you actually do your research, who you're accountable to, because when you're just reading novels, who are you really accountable to? Again, I'm not trying to knock literary people, but I feel sometimes I go to conferences, even the one that I was the council member and leadership position for, And I see a lot of literary theory, or also I'll attend a panel, and sometimes there'll be a person from a discipline that, you know, is completely employing what we would call exogenous or external theories. It's not to say that we can't use those theories or internalize them or whatever, but their approach is much different. They're trying to get at like what they would think of as like a thought experiment, and some native people are the subfield or the subcontext or the you know, the subtext to this like larger, greater discussion. And I kind of had this like come to God moment or come to creator moment, whatever you want to call it, there. And I was like, this is not a subfield for me, and it's never been a subfield for me. And it's not to say, again, it's not to put anyone down, but it's just like the stakes for me have always been much different, and I'm now realizing it. And when I thought like maybe some of the people that I've, you know, interacted with and read, and who I'm assigning, you know, are, you know, like that this is their primary field, or actually it's a subfield because they're in a different discipline and they're getting their academic and tenure homes are in, you know, lit or anthropology or history or whatever. And mine aren't, you know, I wasn't trained. I mean, I didn't get a degree in American Indian studies, but my commitment, you know, in terms of my academic professionalization has always been to the field. And I feel it, you know, now so more than ever, because I'm here at this, you know, at this department engaged in this. But I wanted to turn to this book because it's a very, like, I think a beautiful book in many ways. We won't be able to get into all of it. You have, I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 10 contributors, or excuse me, 8 contributors. Sorry, I don't know how to count.
That's why you left. That's why you left sciences.
That's why we have climate change today. So. And some of these people I know very well. Jen Marley, who was a host here on the Red Nation podcast, you know, she contributed a really wonderful, beautiful essay to this. Randy Boucher is somebody I knew as a friend, you know, and some of these other folks too I've known kind of peripherally through the field. But the introduction, you know, you talk about this concept of let me get my notes out here real quick. The practitioner theorist, and that it has a lot of different meanings, but I think it has a special resonance to American Indian studies and indigenous studies more broadly. But maybe you could just tell me a little bit about why you're putting that particular concept forward and how it really comes out in the contributions to this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if people haven't had a chance to read the book or one, go buy it. The other part, like in the intro, I tell this conversation that I had between a few of us who at different times had gone through the American Indian Studies program here. We were at the American Indian Studies Association conference, and we were there not as scholars. We had gone through master's and undergrad programs and were working in different places. But we always came back to the conference because we found it to be a very generative place for us. And it was very much like a lot of the work that we were doing in different places was informed by the education that we received here. So we always kept going back because we wanted to stay in touch, not only with the community, but the things that were happening in that space, because it very much shaped even the work that we were doing professionally. And so we were at the conference, and always ends with an association meeting. And we were there, we were participating. And afterwards, a few of us were talking, and we were talking about what our presence and our role was in the association specifically, but then also more broadly, the discipline. And we kind of all had this sense that we thought that the things that we were doing in the various programs, organizations, and communities that we were working for had some value, and that with the way that we were doing AIS in those specific contexts deserved attention, but at the time didn't feel like it was getting the space or even the discussion or attention that maybe we thought that it could have. And so we were saying, like, we were talking there, we said, hey, we should put a book together that really begins to focus on maybe some of the things that we're doing to show that how we theorize and how we practice AIS. And so the book kind of like there was just an idea there. And a few years later, maybe 2 or 3 years later, I reached out to Elise and said, hey, we had this conversation there. And that year, Elise became the president of the association too. Was it the president, Elise, or was it a different?
No, I was the president. Maybe people were reluctant to let me be president of the American Indian Studies Association. But yeah, that kind of coincided around the same time.
And to clarify, reluctant not because she's an awful leader, but reluctant because she was a junior faculty. Yeah.
Yep.
And so Elise was the president that year. And so I remember she was there and we talked a few years later and said, hey, we had this conversation about this book. And is it something that you think, because I was looking to Elise as, by this time I had entered a PhD program and I was looking to Elise as the person that I was deferring to offer advice on whether this might be a good idea and whether she wanted to help me put this book together. And so we agreed and we kind of started from there. And we specifically, when we started to put the book together, we started thinking about people we know or we're in community with that were doing the type of thing that we wanted to focus on, saying, okay, who are people that graduated from Native Studies programs, whether it was at the undergraduate level, at a master's level, or a PhD level, who are doing things in the community that isn't only research and scholarship. And then let's focus on what they're doing and how they're doing it. And that was kind of beginning like to put the book together. And I'm going to tee it to Elise to talk a little bit more about like how the term specifically like practitioner theorists, we started playing around with that.
Yeah, so just kind of like adding a little bit to that, part of it is like we were trying to find language to articulate, right, the idea of how people are coming from their community with their own knowledge systems, their own understandings, and then coming into higher education, but that they are also theorizing about the work that they're doing. And so, Jerome and I kind of went back in because it even goes back to like a original title for our book, where it was like from the nation to the academy and back again. And I don't know, Jerome, if because you like to nerd out in a different level than I do. You wanted to dive in where we got that original from.
Yeah, it's Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo Baggins' book. So I'm like, yeah, let's. And
some things are just better left unsaid.
Yeah.
So, like that was not part of the conversation. But it is so like and so eventually like like part of it, and that's also I think it all lends itself to even like our shift in the title, because one of the things is that we were talking about was like that they were taking their knowledge, they were going and encountering American Indian Studies at the university, and then we thought that was informing, but then as we worked with our different contributors, what we realized is that AIS was also informing the things that they already knew. And that it wasn't just, oh, I'm encountering a discipline. How does that help me make sense of things, right, that I've known, things from my community? It was the opposite of that. And so that idea, right, of practitioner, like theorist, and you'll see that in our introduction, we cite the work of, again, Waziat was so central to both of our, I would say, kind of growth as like intellectuals and our understanding of the discipline. And also to be unapologetically who we are and to advocate for that. But they use that term in their book for Indigenous Eyes Only, about like intellectuals, again, rooted in tribal communities who are dedicated to helping Indigenous peoples move toward freedom from the oppressive forces of colonialism. And that, again, like when we talk about, like they were talking specifically about practitioner activist, but our goal is that we wanted to, with practitioner theorists, is to talk about people who are immersed in their community, and again, who are driven by that desire and the love that they have for their people to address colonialism and to and through different ways and through like various acts of decolonialism. That's kind of what we, again, like when we were thinking about that, is how do they think about that? How do they theorize that? And then ultimately, how do they dismantle like those colonial structures? And so that is one of the things I think in terms of when we thought about practitioner theorists, we again because of the discipline. And kind of, Nick, going back to your original question, it's like it was so hard because you could have included so many people, but we did take a very specific approach to here in, like, again, in the United States, the continental United States. And we tried to pick people from different communities that also came from different programs, to kind of illustrate the diverse ways in which people are doing who are taking these different knowledge systems in defense of tribal nations, on behalf of their people. And again, like, and I think that's the important work that many of them are doing. And that's what we wanted to highlight. From a more academic, I would say from an institutional perspective, right? One of the challenges that we have here, is even at USD, Nick, and you might not be unfamiliar with some of this, is to fight for the legitimacy of our discipline, right? And how do we prove, right, that we are a standalone discipline and that we are just as, legitimate as any other discipline, whether within the humanities or in the social sciences. And one of the things is always like, well, what do you do with a degree, right? Like, what do you do with any of that? And I now can use this and be like, well, my standard answer used to always be, well, what can't you do? You can literally do anything with this, but then now it's, I think, a good example to show that there's so many different things that people can do, because what it is, like, I think, Jerome, kind of going back to what you're saying about asking those critical questions, but it's also doing the work. And then how can you implement that work, whether in, like, the healthcare system, right? Whether it's in, like, working with young people, whether it's working on things within your community, you can find ways to do that. And those interventions and intersections are there, which I think our contributors also highlight.
Yeah. I just want to add, like, one really quick thing is when it's interesting, those of you who've had an opportunity maybe to work on a book like this, and then it's a volume, how it can shift over the course of working on a project. And when we started out, we, as Elise said, the original title, Nation to Academy and Back Again, we were, at the time when we started this, we're focusing on what is it that is being taught in American Indian Studies programs across the country, and what is it that students are attracted to, and what are the things that they find useful for the work that they again do. So it was interesting because when we started out, the focus was on what are Native Studies programs teaching, and what is it that takes what that has a lot of value for students. But as we started working with these specific contributors, the focus started to shift, because a lot of them, when they started talking about the things that they were doing in their community, for example, Randy Lynn Boucher writes about a girls' camp that she put together, and Sean Brigman writes about architectural recovery that he's doing in his community. And Brittany Arona writes about the work that she does with dam removals. And but in all of those stories, there was a moment before they even entered their Native Studies programs that was so foundational to how they thought about the programs and the knowledge that they were encountering. So the starting point, if we put in quotes, the starting point was not really Native Studies, but it was knowledge that they learned from their community and their elders, their grandparents. And so it was like, okay, we need to reframe what we're thinking about, how this knowledge is moving and how they're putting these things together. Because for them, it started to look like, okay, our people think this, and Native Studies helps us do this. And that was might seem like the simplest shift, but we're like, okay, our starting point is different. And the way that we started to think about what a practitioner theorist does and how they do it shifted significantly, because the theorizing was always starting from within a very specific context that was informing the practice too. And that small shift for us really just helped us to think more about how knowledge is moving and where knowledge is moving to.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And just for folks who are following along, we do have some questions. So if you want to ask a question from our guests, please feel free to do so. I sent a link to what appears to be a comprehensive guide to Native American. It's called A Guide to Native American Studies Programs in the United States and Canada by Robert M. Nelson. I don't know who that is, but I do know that I've used this guide before. So It should be in the show notes or in the chat if you want to check out a link. It's quite extensive. I think it's okay. So it is for Canada and the United States, and there are quite a few, a lot more than I thought. And I don't know how many are. They don't have it broken up by doctoral or by department, but you can look at that. It's quite extensive. And I think also getting back to some of the, like, what do you do with a degree in American Indian Studies? One thing I find out, like, from here, so there's no federal Indian law program here, which I think is like really fascinating. This is a Big Ten school, so a lot of pre-law students end up taking my federal Indian law or my federal Indian policy course or my treaty law and sovereignty course, because they just don't get any of that training in the law school here, which is actually like pretty scary, if you think about it. That these are the future lawmakers, judges, lawyers who are going through our system, who have literally, they're not being, maybe they get it like a little bit like in their class, but it's an entire section of the law that requires specialty and specialization. I know that the University of South Dakota has a fairly robust Indian law program, and I know that ASU probably has one too. New Mexico had one. Jerome's Googling it right now.
Yeah. They're typing.
But they, it's quite fascinating because they're, like, if you don't know these laws, like these are actual like separate jurisdictions. We have our own laws. We have our own governance systems. The way that our natural resources are managed, the way that funding operates, within these contexts, the way that people vote, all of those sorts of things are, if you don't know the law, like, it's just fascinating. You're getting a civics lesson, but you're kind of leaving off some of the oldest forms of government, and well, it's not some of the oldest forms, the oldest forms of government in this land. And so that's something I always remind people about. The other part about it is, when people come into the classroom, they have these preconceived notions about what treaties are. All treaties are bad. They were like bad land deals, and a lot of them were. But we also interpret those treaties. We also interpret those relationships, and that's really what we center is those perspectives. And if you take that into the realm of how you do research and why you do research, that's also there's a different sort of levels of accountability to doing that research. It's not just, I think some people think you can just go into a community and, interview some people, people write books on this, actually. They'll just go in and talk to some natives, and then they all of a sudden become the experts on, on this. And Vine Deloria Jr. writes about this very, a lot in Custer Died for Your Sins. That's another book that y'all should read. At least the first 5 chapters are really good at sort of laying out what became American Indian Studies at that time. But I want to turn to this notion of, when we talk about Indigenous studies in the community, because that really gets thrown around a lot about. And you guys are actually pushed back on this notion that scholarship should just follow community concerns, because we are intellectuals and we are academics, and the people who are contributing to this volume are not just kind of like at the behest of the community and sort of taking guidance from them. I think about this, to kind of go back to that researcher question too. There are some folks, I don't know if I tried to take his book off my shelf, so you can't see it back there, but his name is Pekka Haimalainen. He's this Finnish guy, and he wrote this book called Lakota of America. We've talked about it on this podcast several times. But what's fascinating about this is, in any other discipline, like if you did Russian studies and you were like, I'm going to study Russia, and you didn't learn the language, you didn't go to Russia, you didn't, engage in the vast, history of, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, whatever, people wouldn't take you serious. Like, why? You don't even read the language. You don't know the concepts, you're not engaged in any conversations. But that's actually how a lot of people have made their careers, because they assume there's an absence of something. they then become the experts. I'm reviewing a book right now, which I thought was going to be pretty good. I'm not going to name the name, but the guy literally opens the book saying the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota people don't have an umbrella term of what they call themselves. And I was like, this is on the second page. This is published last year. Like, this wasn't like, some kind of old text. So, and this guy, this is with an academic publisher. And I was like, dude, did you guys have an editorial process? Well, the guy who edited the book has tenuous claims to indigeneity, so that might be a problem. But going back to the contributors of this book, there's no question, it's not just about authenticity. I think there's kind of this false accusation or equivalency to that we're doing some kind of essentialism, that only Native people have this kind of insight or are allowed to do this kind of things. But they're writing from a grounded community, a grounded community sense and a grounded community perspective, right? And I think that's something worthwhile. Can we talk a little bit about this tension that does exist with communities, with Native communities, while also being in defense of sovereignty and our nations? There's also this kind of accusation that we are kind of tailing the aspirations of these nations, even if they do bad things, or these communities. That's not the case. And if you can talk about like how you work out these tensions. Jerome, you talked about critical Diné studies, but there's also critical indigenous studies. And so I don't know if you want to kind of add to that, like because it's not just, you're not just sitting there like towing the party line, so to speak. You're not just repeating what the tribal chairman says all the time. You're doing this in a very critical and intellectual way.
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably it's interesting, again, like going back to putting a book like this together, that some of the things that end up on the cutting room floor, that I'm recalling the conversations that we've had with these various contributors about being particular individuals that maybe had decolonial commitment and perspectives about, let's say, gender relations that were inconsistent with the way maybe the community saw itself, and that would push back on needing to ask questions about violence against women and girls. And like in those instances, they would say, we always get told that we need to listen to the community and meet the community where the community is at. But like in that instance, I think it's super important for them to be the type of individuals that they were, living where they were and being in such close contact in the community that they were in, because it was a challenging situation for a lot of them, because the politics of it could get really ugly. In any Native communities, in the worst cases, in the worst situations, like communities might disenroll someone for asking the wrong questions or pushing and get up against the wrong person, your tribal chairman, maybe, for example. And so there was like a lot of sensitive things that they were grappling with from day to day. But at the same time, I believe, and I'd be curious to hear from Elise too, though, that was also the reason why that they were the best people to do the things that they were doing and ask the questions that were, because it had that insider perspective and could still push the conversation in really important ways, and then sometimes to their own detriment, I think. And I think like that for me, I would like to at least come back to that sometimes, and maybe that's a whole separate book about how people navigate those tensions and those problems, being from the community that you are. Just because I'm from Navajo doesn't mean that I'm exempt from asking myself these questions or being held responsible to, but then also the responsibility of making sure that we are asking questions about the important questions. And so for me, like I think about how I do my work. I'm working on a manuscript now that's titled Bundle, and there was some things that you were saying, Nick, that was just kind of fresh in my mind too, as I read a lot of the archive that was assembled by outsiders on Navajo people, and just the consistency of various things that they say about like who we are, is like we're late arrivals and we're stealing from everybody around us, and how that then informs how the government thinks about us and writes about us. And for me, like juggling these things and trying to think about it like from a Diné perspective, and trying to do that in a way that thinks about that does it and from a critical perspective, but then prioritizing like Navajo knowledge, just saying, okay, we know that the archive says all these awful things about us. What is it that our stories say about us, and how is it that we can reread or re-narrate how we see ourselves and our existence in this place, and how we negotiate all of those things. And I think that, like, when I think about American Indian studies, that's probably one of the things, like the ethics and the navigating those complexities is probably some of the more I think a lot of people who write about Native people that aren't aware of Native studies need to become aware of some of those things, because they're doing work irresponsibly and unethically. And Elise has this experience with someone that she'll probably tell us about, that was writing about people that they hadn't even gone into that community too. And from my perspective, like, how can you even do that? Like, that makes no sense that you would do something like that.
I was going to say, I don't know, there's so many where that's happened. I was like, let me pick the right story.
Which one are you talking about?
Which Filagana were you talking about?
So this is like, I think this is like the challenge, right? Because I think like so many things are running through my head in terms of, as both you, Nick, and then Jerome are talking, is because like this is why I think our field is always faced with like questions about legitimacy, because it's that idea that only Indigenous people can do Indigenous studies, right? And what we're saying, and I think what our book demonstrates, that's not true. It's just that these individuals are so invested, right, and part of their community, as Jerome was pointing out, that's why they're doing the work that they're doing. But again, I like kind of expanding upon, Nick, what you shared earlier about that book. I think that book and many others, right? Like there's so many different examples, unfortunately. In Waziatuin's book, Decolonizing the Eli Taylor Narratives, she talks about that in her introduction, right? Even from a historical perspective, you would not study Spain, right, and not learn Spanish. And the list goes on. But how is it okay that you are writing in about Dakota people, but you actually don't know Dakota, or you haven't gone into our communities? And so part of that's like that issue of like accountability, right? Is like you're asking questions because sometimes those questions, I feel like, honestly, are just, it's because it's your own genuine curiosity, but they're not necessarily questions I think that the community is interested in, you know, in answering or in engaging, or they already have answered that, right, in their own ways, or they have or we have our own stories. The other part of it too, I think, is like one of the challenges is just that like there's questions that particularly non-Indigenous people are asking that should not even be asked, right? Like I always come back to like these examples of ceremony, right? Where it's like, well, why are you asking those questions? What do you want to know about it? And is that really your place? And I think the reason why, again, like Jerome's like point to that question is part of like Indigenous studies has been siloed, I think, not through its own choices, but by other disciplines who have a stake, right, in the study of Indigenous people. And in doing so, don't encourage their students or expand their theories and methodologies to be rooted in Indigenous studies, because it's a very different way of asking questions and to ask the questions of the archives. And that example that Jerome was talking, where I happened to be at a different, again, a historical association. I attended the conference because it had Fort Peck in the title, and I wanted to see who this person was and what questions they were asking. And in that presentation, of course, I'm on my phone asking my auntie and my dad, like, who is this person? Why? This is what they're saying about this family. That's not what I've, you know, heard growing up. And immediately it's that question back from, again, community, where that was, you know, oh, that person's actually not from this family. They were married in. And so they're actually not Dakota. They are Lakota. But you would know that if you knew the family, right? Like lineage and stories. At the very end of the presentation, you know, they kind of conclude with this idea that Poplar, where I grew up, and Fort Peck is, you know, a desolate place on the, you know, in the northern plains. And I was like, gee, I was like, way to paint my community, right? Because I love my community. But the fact is, and I asked in the questions, have you gone to Poplar? No, it was the pandemic. And I said, no, we did close down and we shut our point at a certain point, but it's been X amount of years since like basically the right, like the original response. that if you wanted to ask questions, you could have, and you need to go to that community. All that to say is that person and that individual are trying to, again, go back and trying to approach things differently. But it's hard once you've immersed yourself in different theories and methodologies that you're studying a people that you had yet really visited. You formed ideas about us that weren't even accurate. You depicted us, right, like as the Northern Plains, like as desolate. And it feeds into those narratives about Indigenous people. And I think, I guess, like, just to kind of wrap up that part of it is, I think that's why that accountability is important, because for many of us, right, when we are working with in our communities, with our communities, on behalf of our communities, so there's a different type of responsibility, right? Because this is who we are. It matters to us because we want to see the future of our nations and our people. But that is very different responsibility than other people. And one of the things I always tell my students to think about too is, how can this become a reciprocal relationship? How can you also give back in ways, and that the community should also see the research that you're doing. Anything you're writing about a people should not be a surprise once it gets to publication. Like you know what I mean? Like, we should be reading, because that way that, so I don't know if that helps, or at least highlights that perspective.
Just one really quick story to something that Elise was talking about, like other disciplines, siloing, Native studies, is we were at the same conference Elise was talking about, the Western History Association. We were on a panel together, and it was a pretty good sized audience. And somebody had asked a question about like resources that they might be able to look at. And we listed off like for us would be no brainers, like Linda Tue Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies. I specifically had like a what the fuck moment when, as soon as we started listening, like almost everybody in that room was like started writing stuff down. And in my mind, I'm thinking, this is the first time they're hearing a lot of these books. And in my mind, I was thinking, that's a big problem, that this, like, people who are, a lot of the people there are studying Native people and not having heard about people that are standard text, and that they should, if they're studying Native people, should know, have to know. And that I always come back to that. And I always like, now, if I don't take for granted that people will know things that we do know, that's like our students know for sure. So anytime I'm in a space, I'm like, you all need to read this if you haven't. Like, do it for other disciplines, because of the way that they've siloed us or themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I judge people by who they cite, and if they're entering this conversation, like this is a problem with the academy. I don't like going to academic conferences very much anymore. It's really expensive. But I also think there's a lot of big claims that are made, and I've become more like a conservative, not like politically conservative, but conservative in the sense that like we shouldn't be kind of like wedded to this notion of novelty all the time, especially when we have such a large body of tradition and precedent to draw on, because it's actually a discredit to the people who have gone before us, like Elizabeth Cook Lynn. She's like saying all this stuff, and like she had so much to write about what's happening in Palestine right now, some of which probably, if she was alive today, she would probably lose her job for saying these things, because of the, she's even sometimes a little bit more strident than I am, and I say a lot, but like she has a very kind of incisive kind of perspective, and a very sharp perspective. But it's my question is always, why is she not included in these, big lists that people make, or all these books that, people are assigning, or they're not, nobody's really thinking with her. The way they write her off as this kind of like cranky old woman, which she was, but she deserved to be cranky. she had a right to be cranky. And she was, she was a very, she was a critic. I would submit writing to her, and she'd like just send it back and be like, what is this? Like it was just like very critical stuff, but it was because for her, the stakes of writing were really important. And in fact, it was kind of, while I was like, after I got back from the NASA conference, I was like reading my stuff, and I actually wrote a thing about Elizabeth Cook Lynn, because after she passed, it was kind of like, it was really sad for me, because I didn't really, there was never like really any, closure. We were friends. She's an important person in my life, but I also felt like there wasn't an acknowledgement really, like even maybe in ASA there was, but not in other kind of areas. And I was like, I didn't read her memoir, but I opened. She gave me a copy of it. I was at it. We did a book event together, and she was selling her memoir. And I only have 2 signed copies, and it's the first book she ever gave me and the last book she ever gave me.
Mm-hmm.
And that last book was that memoir. And so I opened it up, and it's actually about her life as an academic. And I read the last chapter because I'm silly and I always read the last chapter of everything. But it was a really beautiful book. It was, it was about, it was called Keapi, and which means they say. And so that was kind of her famous phrase, and I just find it such a kind of a while that she was very much against this kind of careerism that kind of inculcated and indoctrinated to write these like new flashy novel things, when I think there's such a large body of history and that hasn't really been told from our perspective, even though there's all these books on it. I can read these books over and over again, like as they're coming out every single year, and they still have so many inaccuracies. So there is such a need for the perspectives that we're talking about. And one other thing, when you're talking about community, I always find it fascinating when we talk about the Native community, we're homogenized, but every other community is allowed to be heterogeneous and diverse. And to assume that like we all have sort of equal knowledge of all these things about our tribes or our histories is also kind of insulting, because we are incredibly diverse. Like even within the Ocheti Shakoni, like some of our tribes have engaged in like active civil war. Like if you think about Wounded Knee, 1973, that was a low scale civil war within the tribe. Like people were not in agreement, like about the future of what tribal sovereignty meant. And so these things have, political stakes and consequences, and how we get them right to understand, our place in this world. And before we turn to some of the questions from our viewers and listeners, I wanted to ask this question because I asked you in Oklahoma City, and I'm just going to ask it in front of the world now. But what is the future of American Indian studies?
I feel it's funny that you asked that question, because that question has been haunting me since Lisa. And I was like, why did I start? So it was funny because there was a number, I went through a number of different thoughts in that moment. And the first thought was, what does Native studies and the work that I do look like beyond colonialism? And then I backed off that response, and I was like, well, what do I do, and why do I do? And so I was kind of like, so I've been thinking about that since, because then at the end, we eventually ended up back there. And I think it's a question that I'm still thinking about. And for me, the thing that I care about, and the thing that my book meditates on, is it's based on a few premises. One is we have a very vibrant knowledge system in place, and we were intelligent about the stories that we told, the knowledge that we created. But when you look at the archive about everything that's assembled on us, it's not that. It seems like we were just a zombie horde, just roaming the Southwest, consuming everything. And I'm sharing this because for me, when I think specifically about what is the future of critical Diné studies, it's always coming back to doing thinking within our specific context and theorizing from our specific place for our purposes that aren't only about colonialism, that aren't only about surviving this moment And so I always, like, since then I've been thinking, what would that look like for me and for Diné people? And I I'm hoping that the work that I'm doing is that it opens, or at least benchmarks, for any students that are Diné after me to not have to justify that very basic premise that we are intelligent and that our knowledge systems are theoretical and are philosophical, and that having that starting point will allow them to begin and think within a place that I wasn't able to do. And so, like, when I think about what that possibility looks like, it's hopefully the center is going to move somehow, but I'm not too sure what that looks like. And that's why that question has been haunting me a lot. It's like probably the question I think of when I wake up, and then it's like when I'm walking to my car, I'm like, that darn question. It's like, how, like, what does that look like?
I'm living like rent free in your brain.
Yeah. and I don't think I've been like, it's appropriate that you're asking the question again, because it's still something that I'm struggling with, and the best I can do is like gesture toward this space that I'm hoping that me and my other Diné colleagues are working toward, where our starting point isn't having to justify that our knowledge systems are valuable, and that they're not only cultural, that they're political and theoretical, and that they're saying important things about being human and being a person in the world, and offering, have said and are continuing to say things about different relationships, and that things aren't having to be the way that they are, I think. Anyway, it's a non-answer, but yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think, Nick, you also live rent-free in my head, because after we were talking about that at NASA, I was like, gosh, why did I answer it in such an academic, like, professor, like, oh, the future of American Indian Studies is that we're a standalone discipline, blah, blah, like, because that's like how I exist, because I feel like since I've been here at USD, it's always fighting for the right to exist on our terms as a discipline, right? And so I think you're always struggling with that, demonstrating, and at an institution that values, right, worth the value of a program through enrollment, it's challenging, right? Because I always tell people, and American Indian Studies, Native American Studies is for everybody, right? Like, you can look at Dwayne Champagne's, right, like, in response to this, but part of it is still, how do you do that? And what's interesting, I think, is like, how do you start where you're not even having to make visible the colonialism or settler colonialism in all its forms in our everyday life, right? The fact that I think that we still exist within these structures makes it challenging. But I'll go back to thinking about, like, Elizabeth Cookland, right, as a Dakota woman and scholar. I know she talks about this in the different things that she writes, but I think kind of, Jerome, it echoes what you were mentioning, but it is about that immersion into our knowledge that is driven by place, right? And so I think, like, that to me, and then also Waziatowina is one of my favorite peoples and scholars, and just her unapologetic directness on how we imagine, right, like, a decolonization. And I think for me, it's like, how do we just imagine that is, like, really that first step in thinking of what the future of American Indian Studies is that we have to vision that it is possible for us to exist on our terms, right? And that's not even as a discipline, right? It's literally just as Indigenous people. I think, to me, that is what I hope that the direction of American Indian Studies, I think, is to make that a reality, right? But we are doing that through the ways in which we privilege knowledge, the ways that we write, the ways that we think about our place in the world. That's what I hope that I give to my students, as a way to articulate, much, Jerome, like what you're doing, is I want them to find their place, that they have every right to be in these spaces, but to exist on their terms, and to do that without, right, like, saying that we have to be and exist as sovereign people. We can exist as Dakota, right, as Lakota, as Dene, without the government, right? It's just, how do we imagine what that can look like? And I think for me, that is what I think our future would be, is to to immerse ourselves in that unapologetically, as uncomfortable, right, and as much resistance as we may meet from others.
Yeah, those are both really good answers. And I was thinking about what you were just saying, Elise, and it's like every like the colonizer is really good at saying this is impossible, right? And we've internalized it. Oh, this we can't do, can't get the Black Hills back. Doksha, Kesapa is what they say, or Pahasapa. Doksha Pahasapa, like goodbye Black Hills. But I think what you both are saying is like it provides us the tools to analyze the structure, but it also, I think the aspect that gets missed a lot, it's not just about talking about all the bad stuff. I try to do this in my book, is like, to look at the long tradition that was passed down, like there wasn't this like break, historians are always like periodizing everything. Like, after Wounded Knee, it's like, but like, did the people after Wounded Knee, did everyone just like not forget what happened before 1890? Or like, was there not, there was a carryover? And I think had I not, been part of, in conversation with Elizabeth Cook-Lynn and, been involved in American Indian Studies the way that I had, I'd have done the historian thing and wrote a periodized history, that would not have allowed me to ask the questions that I asked. And so, and I think it's really great, in that sense that there's still a purpose in decolonizing knowledge. And yeah, if you don't know any of the names that we're saying today, it's like, get on it, open up Elizabeth Cook-Lynn, look up Wazia Dewi. Her book, Remember This, the Eli Taylor Narratives, is really good. I teach that one. Students love it. And I also teach What Does Justice Look Like? It's a phenomenal, both are phenomenal texts. But if you guys have a couple minutes, we have some questions, if you don't mind answering them. The first one is for Jerome. Is the Loch Ness Monster a
What are
kidding.
recent findings on the Loch Ness Monster?
Yeah, there's a Jerome Clark out there who's a cryptozoologist. So like, when I got asked to preface this book, it says by J. Jeffrey Clark. I was like, who's J. Jeffrey Clark? Yeah. There's Jerome. He doesn't want to be confused with the cryptozoologist who writes on the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and UFOs.
And the confusion has happened because I get people who will be emailing me asking me if they can interview me about my.
You should do it. You should just get on there. Start talking about like little people or something. Yeah. I don't know what you're. Okay, so we have just like several questions. Like some of them are just you were talking about this, Elise, but it's like, is it possible for like settlers to participate in decolonization process, or is this just intended for Native people?
I think that's a really good question, because I do think that we talked about this actually. Interestingly enough, I'm teaching a Indigenous women's course this semester, right? And we kind of do a lot of foundational work in the first few weeks in terms of defining terms, and then actually, I think Jerome, you was also assigned the same article, decolonizing, Indigenous feminisms, but looking at mainly Arvin, and then like Eve Tuck's work. But part of it in there is where I think for decolonization, I was talking with my students about this, is that, even though like Wazia Deween or like Michael Yellowbird's book For Indigenous Eyes Only, right? It's not just for Indigenous people, right? I think everybody would benefit from decolonization because about structures, right? And my example specifically would be about gender, right? Like, so when we talk about like the structures of like gender and kind of looking at heteropatriarchy, et cetera, like the binary of male and female. But if we look at that through like a decolonial lens, right, or a Native feminist theorist like lens that changes the way we understand gender. And that ultimately, I think, is like liberatory for everyone and not just Indigenous, communities and peoples. So I think it is, also settlers can participate in that, because I think allyship is important. And that, again, I think like the other part, like I teach my students, is that decolonization is also a process, and it begins with your mind. And how do we think about that, right? And even with my students, like most of my students who take my class are non-indigenous. And so some of the questions, right, that we talk about is like, if we live here in Vermilion, right, do you know what tribal, indigenous peoples lived here before? Right. And placing that and kind of like understanding how they also benefit from those systems, I think are important. But I do think, again, it should be, and it can be, those that work alongside with like indigenous peoples and communities.
Yeah, I would agree with Elise. Like, decolonization requires settlers' participation, because we're talking about settler colonialism here, and settler colonialism affects everyone. And we all have a responsibility to do something about this problem. And I think we only have to look at everything, all the crazy, shitty things that are happening right now, to answer that question of why we all need to respond to this. And just as much as I have a responsibility to ask these questions because of the genocide that's happening to our Palestinian relatives, like for me, there's local responsibilities, national responsibilities, and global ones too. And we all have a role in that. And I would say that we all have different responsibilities within that, though. And I would say settler colonialism is more of a white problem than it is an indigenous problem. And so you all have major responsibilities, anybody that are non-indigenous who are benefiting from the occupation of native lands, to do something about it, right? So, yeah.
Good answers. This is kind of a funny story. I was sitting at a ceremony, and there was an elder talking, and he was speaking in Lakota, and I know enough to understand like the basic concepts of what he was saying, but he was talking about how all these presidents have done awful things, and he would speak Lakota, and then he would say Thomas Jefferson. He'd speak Lakota, and then he would say Andrew Jackson. He'd speak Lakota, and then say like Abraham Lincoln. And then when he got to, he started talking about more contemporary things, like about the theft of children, the breaking up of families, the genocide in Gaza, all of those things. And he stopped himself and he goes, Wichasha Shazi. He didn't say Donald Trump. He said Wichasha Shazi, which means the orange man. So I was like, I found out the Lakota name for anyways. So we have one final question. This is from Amanda Tovar, and they're asking about how do we collectively move beyond colonial understandings and definitions of indigeneity. It's kind of a three-part question, but like how do we get into the nuances of some of the terms that were something that kind of derived from us, but are now being used to sort of deny rights to other people in various ways. And I guess like to add to that question, is like indigenousness a liberatory like framework, or I'm kind of summarizing what she or what they had said in the questions.
I'm looking at Elise again.
I was like, am I the oldest on here? I just want to make sure I understand the question, because I think I just, if I can ask it back, is so to move beyond indigeneity, like those terms that are like, where you're saying like that idea of indigenousness, like as a framework for liberation.
You're on mute, Nick.
Sorry.
I'll ask the second question, or the first question. I'll just ask it in its entirety.
Okay, sorry.
Because it's a multi-part question. It's kind of confusing. How do the collective we move beyond colonial understandings and definitions of indigeneity, considering that the U.S. is intent on denying humanity to entire population or populations so that they can deny citizenship and rights to these same populations? What I'd like to understand is how to implement the nuance in the classroom. For some reason, people are having difficulty recognizing similarities between, the similarities of empire and their schematics. Not quite sure what that last part means, but.
Are you going to go, Jerome?
Oh, I'm still processing. Go ahead.
I mean, can we process a few more minutes collect? I'm going to talk, but it's mostly because as I like kind of think I understand part of it, and maybe I don't, but I think like the way I'm understanding the question, right, about that idea of like indigeneity reminds me of immediately of like settler colonialism. And when you look at like how settlers, right, who in a sense become like indigenous through the process, where indigenous people become like the other. I don't know if that's like kind of that understanding, right, where like those ideas then are they then being used to then define other people, like the citizenship, I guess. I'm still struggling with the question.
Yeah.
I think it's like the citizenship or like a way to disenfranchise other people when they themselves, are the problem. I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't know, Jerome, if you.
Yeah, I'm maybe mishearing the question too. And when I said I was processing, I was trying to find an escape route real quick. No, but I guess the way that I'm hearing about it is that, sometimes we have people who will criticize like nationhood or nationalism or sovereignty as being exclusionary. And sometimes the possibility of, at least a critique, is that reinscribing the very thing that we're going against. And maybe kind of hearing the question around indigeneity similarly, or maybe mishearing it, but I'm automatically coming back to maybe, I don't know if it's a moving beyond or a digging deeper of, because I do know that there's challenges around it. Again, I'm always going to come back to the Diné context because that's what I do and that's who I am. And there are points in which our understanding of what it means to be a Diné person has become entangled in very complicated ways with oppressive structures. And sometimes we might be the ones within our own communities that are upholding those very dangerous ideas. And so what it means to be Diné, sometimes the way people think about it can become exclusionary and eliminatory. And I write about this in one article around specifically language. But I think part of that is like, in our specific context, how do we dive deep into what it means to be Diné and its intent of not being exclusionary for us specifically as Navajo people? And how do we challenge these practices that maybe push people outside of our community, outside of our homelands, for whether it's gender or language or how we perceive what it means to be a Diné person? I don't think that's the same as saying let's move beyond Diné-ness. What I do think is that we need to dig deeper into what it is we understand Diné to be by looking at our philosophies and our theories, to then broaden it so that we're able to encounter the complexity of the world and the boundaries that are set up that we've kind of somehow become entangled with. So I'm thinking specifically about our ideas around gender and sexuality and the way that tradition has become entangled in that process to exclude people and push people out to like borderlands and urban spaces. And I think we as Navajo people need to dig into our idea of Diné-ness to rethink what that means for us and not to operate in exclusionary ways. And so I don't know if it's a moving beyond, but I think it's a digging further into so that we're better articulating, because my sense of what it means to be a Diné person and my understanding of the oral stories and the philosophies, is it exclusionary? It's also demands of us that we look at those oppressive structures and we look at our relationship locally, but also globally. Like, what responsibilities do Diné people have to Palestinians? And so for me, it's not a moving past, it's a further digging into and better understanding our place in the world.
Yeah, I think Yeah, the question is confusing, but I think I was thinking about this podcast I did with Justin Poder recently, and it was called the Book of Genocide. We like looked at the Book of Joshua from the Bible and how it's been used to justify genocide, and just kind of like various interpretations, like pushing back on it to say, like, our Native or American Indians, Canaanites, who are being colonized, so that they can create like a utopia or whatever, the promised land. And I actually think like after reading like just the really horrific stuff and seeing what's playing out, and like the way that these Zionists are using this biblical language to talk about this genocide, I'm like, I actually just don't think you should. I don't want to be a Canaanite. Like, I don't, I think we should reject that framework. Like, I don't want to identify with it. Whether this is a true or made up story, it doesn't matter. I don't want anything to do with this, because it kind of just puts us in this binary of like always either being on the receiving end or the victims of this thing. And at the end of the day, I would say this is like, I don't really want to be indigenous. I just want to be Lakota. Had the United States not colonized us, that's all I would be, that seems radical, but I think it's like where I'm at right now. I'm like, I'd rather provincialize these other narratives because they provincialized us, and nobody has a problem with that. But I would rather provincialize these other narratives. And the only way, like, it's kind of answering both of your questions, or it's kind of building on both what you said, is that we can only find some of those answers internally. It doesn't mean that we reproduce, but it sometimes does, because we're human. The oppressive nature of these nation states and these colonial systems definitely does happen, but I think we do tend to, because of our proximity to the colonizer, it's just an inevitable effect that we identify more with them, and we have to move away from that than to say that this should not be our experience. That there's an entire world. I was reading a essay by this he was a kid, I think he was like 16 years old at one of the survival schools in Minneapolis, and it was written in like 1980, and it was said, just remember, like, white people need to realize that they're not the majority of the planet, and that like Western European imperialism is not, it's coming from a minority population, and we as Native people need to stop thinking about ourselves as a minority. We're actually in the majority, because our experience is the same as a lot of people when it comes to colonization. I was like, wow, this kid gets it. Like, we should be able to get that as well, and anyways, that's kind of a long answer, but I think we are a little bit over time. I thank you both for joining. I don't know if you have any final thoughts, if you have anything you want to plug. I know this book is published through the University of Arizona Press. You can pick it up on their website. We'll put a link in the show description or in the chat. But you also are working on another project. I don't know if it's premature to talk about that, or if there's projects that you're currently working on. You have stuff coming out you want to plug.
Elise, do you mind if I mention the project really quickly? Because I'm hoping your final comments will be you platforming your book, which I'm like,
okay.
I want people to buy your book. Yeah. I'm going to volunteer you to talk about your book. So the next book, we're actually going to be doing a follow-up to this book titled From the Land. And it's going to be, we're going to be putting out a general call. We'll actually have the proposal going to be with U of A Press again. And hopefully by the end of this year, we'll get the go-ahead to start soliciting proposals. And so if you are interested in this idea, we want to just look at what people are thinking about and how people are thinking about their relationship to the specific places that they're in. And so we're going to target a couple of people to do chapters for us. Like one of them is this person by the name of Nephi Craig, who does food sovereignty, just does really cool stuff in the community around cooking and in relationship with the place, and working specifically in a treatment facility, and there's a cafe that runs with it. And so like there will be stuff like that, or maybe people are thinking about other things about their relationship to place, and we're open. We're gonna cast a wide net, hopefully, to capture as many chapters as we can, just meditating on what relationship to place looks like and what it means to come from the land. And that'll be hopefully coming out by this fall and by the end of this fall. And yeah.
My own personal, it's just always uncomfortable. I don't know why to share my own work, but I have my book coming out this October with the University of Oklahoma Press. And it's titled Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. And I can share, Nick, that like the flyer with you later if you want to put it, like add it to like the show notes or something.
We're going to have you back in October for a Red Nation podcast book launch for that. That'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah. I'm excited. It's, you know, it's a long time in the making, but I'm excited it'll be out.
Tell us a little bit about what you do in the book. Now I'm starting interviewing you.
Well, I think Nick said we're at time. As a short little plug, just like a general, is like I am really fascinated with the ideas of settler colonialism, specifically in the LDS Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I'm interested in how they produce knowledge about Indigenous people and how they construct indigeneity through religious doctrine, like the Book of Mormon, and then how they had programs like the Indian Student Placement Program, where again, like in the 1940s, really up through the 1990s, where they were a quote unquote foster program that where they had students who were members of the LDS Church, and they were fostered by Mormon white settler families for the most part. And I'm just, again, like I'm fascinated with the ideas and on their understanding of Indigenous people and how that changed over time, but specifically how they applied it to American Indian peoples here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's going to be a huge impact. You know, I'm really excited. I'm really excited to read it, but it actually like kind of dovetails with the conversation. I've been reading a lot of biblical texts recently. I grew up reading the Bible, by the way. I mean, so like, but I was just like, wow, the early parts of the Bible is like, God was really not a nice person. Very genocidal. A lot of, you know, killing the firstborn baby. Like that was really mean. But I was thinking about some of the parallels with the Book of Mormon. I've only read a little bit of it. I don't know that much. So this is definitely like, yeah. And I think our listeners and our viewers would definitely get a lot out of that. I think the world would get a lot out of that. So very much looking forward to that.
Well, I'm excited. Like I said, like, again, I'll share the link. But part of it was where, you know, everyone wants to point to Catholics and others. And I think the LDS Church of Mormons kind of escape a lot of criticism because they themselves position themselves as a religiously persecuted people. But yeah, like my next project I started was looking at the idea of things that we've talked about, like land, and like Mormons' understanding of land as ways for them to kind of claim and remove Indigenous people as well.
Very dark, but very cool that you're doing that research. Well, thank you both for joining. I probably will have you both on, you know, again. Obviously, you're coming back in October. That's not an invite. That's an order. But yeah, I really appreciate it. And when we get this information out, you know, about the For the Land call for papers, your book, Elise, anything that you're coming out with, Jerome, just send it my way. We'll put it out there on the stream and everything. So appreciate you both for joining. This is a wonderful conversation. But yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks everybody.
Nick. Thank you.